The men got the shows, the men got the songs, the men got the mythology. Pablo Escobar, El Chapo, El Mencho. These are the names that became global brands, the faces on t-shirts, the subjects of Netflix documentaries watched by hundreds of millions of people worldwide. The kingpins, the shooters, the men who built cocaine empires from nothing and died in blood while the cameras rolled. But there is a version of this story that never made it to screen. A version where a woman with an accounting degree outlasted 6 brothers and ran a cartel that none of them could keep alive. Where a woman moved 9 tons of cocaine across 2 continents while telling police she was just a housewife. Where a 20-year-old girl commanded a hit squad that massacred 13 police officers in a single night. The real cartel women were not standing in the background of someone else's story. They were running the money, directing the killings, and building the organizations that the men in front of the cameras could not have survived without. Section 1. What Narcos gets completely wrong about women. When most people think of the drug cartels, they picture men. Pablo Escobar, El Chapo, El Mencho. The kingpins, the shooters. The men who built empires from nothing and died in blood. That image did not come from nowhere. A huge part of it came from the Netflix show Narcos, which millions of people watched and accepted as the definitive story of how cartels work. The problem is that Narcos told half the story, and the half it left out is the half that actually kept these organizations alive. In Narcos and its spin-off Narcos Mexico, women fall into a very small number of roles. They are wives who cry while their husbands make decisions. They are girlfriends who stand in the background of scenes that have nothing to do with them. They are sex objects placed in frame to make a scene more visually interesting. Occasionally, one of them asks a man to leave the drug business, gets ignored, and cries some more. The show was reviewed by critics and fans for years, and multiple pieces of media criticism pointed out the same pattern. When women in Narcos are not being sexualized, they are being sidelined. Refinery29 wrote specifically about Narcos Season 3, noting that when women are not objects of pure lust, they are either crying or screaming in a corner. The executive producer of Narcos, Eric Newman, admitted openly that the show depicts a 50-50 mix of reality and fiction. That admission matters, because the fictional half consistently underrepresented what women were actually doing inside these organizations. The show constructed a world where power was entirely male and women were entirely decorative. That was a choice, not a historical fact. Here is what the show chose not to show. Sandra Avila Beltran, a woman who served as head of public relations for the Sinaloa cartel, was described by U.S. and Mexican officials as a critical link between Mexican and Colombian drug organizations. She managed a shipment of more than 9 tons of cocaine. She was one of only 2 women ever listed among Mexico's top drug traffickers. The Mexican government's Assistant Secretary for Public Security told Newsweek that reaching her level of power inside a cartel was unheard of for a woman. She had her own narco corrido, a folk ballad written in her honor. None of this made it into Narcos. Enedina Arellano Felix ran the financial operations of the Tijuana cartel for years, while her brothers ran the guns and the territory. The U.S. Department of the Treasury sanctioned her under the Foreign Narcotics Kingpin Designation Act in June 2000. After every single one of her brothers was either killed or arrested, she became the head of the cartel. She studied accounting at a private university in Guadalajara before turning those skills into one of the most durable money laundering operations in Mexican cartel history. As of today, she has never been arrested. Narcos Mexico put a version of her on screen, and that version came closer to the truth than anything in the original show. But the real Enedina remains free, unsanctioned, and undefeated in ways no fictional version fully captured. Then there is Maria Guadalupe López Esquivel, known as La Catrina. She was 21 years old. She commanded a hit squad for the Jalisco New Generation cartel. In October 2019, she directed an ambush on a convoy of Michoacan State Police that killed 13 officers. Audio recordings obtained by authorities after the attack captured her cartel superior giving her the order, and captured her confirming the mission would be carried out. Less than 3 months later, she was shot in the neck during a second confrontation with federal forces, the Mexican National Guard, and state police. Body camera footage captured her on the ground, struggling to breathe. A police officer crouched next to her and told her to stay calm, that the helicopter was coming, that she was going to be okay. She died before it reached a hospital. None of these women appear in Narcos, not one. Investigative journalist Deborah Bonello spent years researching women in Latin American cartels and published her findings in the book Narcos, The Secret Rise of Women in Latin America's Cartels, which was reviewed by The Economist, Publishers Weekly, and Kirkus Reviews. Her conclusion was straightforward. The widespread image of cartel women as trophy wives or trafficking victims is a myth that collapses the moment you look at what these women were actually doing. The Economist described the book as a valuable introduction to a subject that deserves more research. Kirkus wrote that the book busts the myth that these women are mere victims. The reason Narcos got this so wrong is not entirely mysterious. Organized crime has always been presented as a space of extreme masculinity, and that framing sells. It makes for cleaner narratives. The hero chases the kingpin. The kingpin controls the empire. The women hover at the edges. Insight Crime, one of the most respected research organizations covering Latin American organized crime, wrote explicitly that narco TV shows consistently portray women as secondary characters, despite the reality that women have been key players in illicit activities at every level of these organizations. Academic research from the University of Mississippi examining women in the Sinaloa cartel found that women participated in cartels both willingly and under coercion, across roles ranging from street-level mules to financial managers to armed enforcers. The research identified single motherhood and economic desperation as major factors driving voluntary participation, but it also documented women who entered cartel life purely for power and advancement, the same reasons men do. Narcos built an image. The real history behind that image is more complicated, more dangerous, and involves women who were operating at levels the show never once acknowledged. The first woman the show almost got right was Enedina Arellano Felix. She studied accounting while her brothers were building one of Mexico's most violent cartels. When every single one of those brothers fell, she was the one left standing. What she built and how she built it goes far deeper than anything Narcos Mexico showed on screen. Section 2. Enedina Arellano Felix, the accountant who outlasted all of her brothers. In 1977, a 16-year-old girl from Mazatlan, Sinaloa had one dream. She wanted to be the Mazatlan Carnival Queen. It was the kind of ambition that felt entirely normal for a teenager. Beauty and pageantry and the spotlight. That dream ended before it started. Her brothers Ramon and Benjamin were already wanted by both the United States government and the Mexican government, and the attention that came with a family member entering a public competition was the last thing the Arellano Felix family needed. The girl put her dream away and turned her attention elsewhere. Her name was Enedina Arellano Felix, and she would go on to outlast every single one of her brothers. The Arellano Felix family was originally from Sinaloa, the same state that produced El Chapo and much of Mexico's modern drug trade. Their uncle was Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, the man known as El Padrino, the godfather of Mexican drug trafficking, who built the Guadalajara cartel before his arrest in 1989. When Félix Gallardo was taken down, his organization split into factions. The Arellano Felix brothers inherited the Tijuana corridor, one of the most strategically valuable drug smuggling routes in the world, because of its proximity to San Diego and Southern California. At the height of their power in the 1990s, the Tijuana cartel was described by American and Mexican authorities as one of the biggest and most violent criminal groups in Mexico. While her 6 brothers were running territory, Ordering killings and maintaining the cartel's brutal reputation, Enadina enrolled at a private university in Guadalajara and earned a bachelor's degree in accounting. She was not pretending to be someone she was not. She was building a skill set. By the mid-1980s, she was already working with the family business, but law enforcement did not consider her a visible threat. She was a woman in an accounting role, operating in the background of an organization built around male violence. That invisibility was the most valuable asset she had. Her primary function in the early years was money laundering. The Tijuana cartel was generating enormous amounts of cash from cocaine and marijuana flowing across the border into California. And that cash needed to become clean money that could be used, invested, and protected from seizure. Enadina built the systems that made that possible. She created front businesses, including pharmacies, and used them to funnel cartel profits into legitimate-looking revenue streams. The DEA and Mexican authorities eventually identified her as the financial brain of the organization, but by the time that recognition arrived, she had already been operating for years without interference. In June 2000, the United States Department of the Treasury sanctioned Enadina under the Foreign Narcotics Kingpin Designation Act. This was not a minor administrative action. The Kingpin Act is the same legal tool the U.S. government uses to target the most significant narcotics traffickers in the world. Being designated under it means the U.S. government has formally identified a person as a key figure in international drug trafficking. Enadina received that designation while her brothers were still alive, still running operations, and still considered the faces of the Tijuana cartel. She was sanctioned not because of who she was related to, but because of what she was doing. Then the brothers started falling. Ramon Arellano Felix, known for his brutal methods, was shot and killed by police during a seaside carnival in Mazatlan in February 2002. A month later, Benjamin was arrested in Zacatecas. Francisco Rafael was arrested in 1993 and later extradited to the United States. Francisco Javier was captured in August 2006. Eduardo, the last brother still operating freely, was arrested after a shootout in Tijuana in October 2008. Francisco Rafael, after serving time in both Mexico and the United States, was shot and killed at a party in October 2013 by an assassin dressed as a clown. One by one, through arrest, extradition, and death, every brother who had stood at the front of the Tijuana cartel was removed. Enadina was still there. After Eduardo's arrest in 2008, Enadina formally took leadership of the Tijuana cartel alongside her nephew, Luis Fernando Sanchez Arellano. Former DEA head of international operations, Mike Vigil, who spent 13 years in Mexico, including time undercover, told Time magazine that as number 2 and then number 1 in the cartel, Enadina shifted the organization's approach entirely. She moved away from the open warfare her brothers had embraced and focused on something more sustainable, making alliances, reducing violence, and getting back to the core business of moving drugs across the border into the United States. Vigil said plainly that she is not into the wars of her brothers and is into making alliances and making money. That strategic shift was significant. Eduardo had led the cartel into a brutal turf war with the Sinaloa cartel in the mid-2000s that left piles of bodies across Tijuana and brought massive law enforcement pressure down on the organization. Enadina's approach was the opposite. According to Insight Crime, after around 2010, Tijuana enjoyed a relative peace that was attributed to a truce between the Tijuana and Sinaloa cartels. Analysts credited that stabilization in part to her leadership philosophy. Luis Fernando Sanchez Arellano, her nephew, was arrested by Mexican police in June 2014. That left Enadina effectively alone at the top. She has never been arrested. She has never faced charges in either Mexico or the United States related to her cartel activity during its peak years. The financial trail her investigators tried to follow went cold. The U.S. Treasury sanction placed on her in 2000 stands as the most concrete legal action ever taken against her, and it did not result in her capture. She remains at large. Narcos, Mexico put her on screen and gave her credit as the financial mind of the operation. What the show could not fully capture was what that actually meant in practice. A woman who used a university accounting degree to build a laundering infrastructure durable enough to survive the collapse of an entire generation of male leadership around her. While Enadina built her empire through balance sheets and shell companies, the next woman on this list took a completely different approach. Sandra Avila Beltran did not stay in the shadows. She walked into rooms, charmed the most powerful men in 2 countries, and moved 9 tons of cocaine while the authorities spent years trying to figure out who she actually was. Section 3. Sandra Avila Beltran, the Queen of the Pacific who bridged 2 continents. Sandra Avila Beltran was born in Baja California in 1960 into a family that was already deep inside Mexico's drug trade. Her father's side of the family was connected to Rafael Caro Quintero, one of the founders of the Guadalajara Cartel. On her mother's side, the Beltran family had been involved in heroin smuggling since the 1970s before moving into cocaine. Most significantly, Sandra was the niece of Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, the man the DEA and Mexican authorities considered the godfather of the entire Mexican drug trade, the boss of bosses who built the Guadalajara cartel before his arrest in 1989 for his role in the murder of DEA Special Agent Enrique Camarena. Sandra did not stumble into the cartel world. She was born inside it. She initially studied communications at the Universidad Autónoma de Guadalajara. By her own account, she intended to become a journalist. That path ended when she was around 21 years old. A jealous boyfriend with ties to the cartels kidnapped her. The details of what happened during that period remain unclear, but what followed it was not. Sandra left her studies and entered the drug business. Within years, she was not a peripheral figure, but a central one. What made Sandra different from almost every other woman operating inside Mexican cartels at the time was the role she occupied. Mexican and U.S. officials described her as the head of public relations for the Sinaloa cartel, a position that had never been held by a woman in a major Mexican trafficking organization before. In practical terms, that role meant she was the person responsible for managing the relationship between the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico and the Norte del Valle cartel in Colombia. She was the connective tissue between 2 of the most powerful drug trafficking organizations in the Western Hemisphere. Former DEA Chief of International Operations Mike Vigil described her as very well tutored by her Colombian boyfriend and said he gave her significant latitude on coordinating and smuggling drugs across the U.S. border. Vigil also said she was attractive and charming and was able to develop a lot of political contacts inside Mexico. That Colombian boyfriend was Juan Diego Espinoza Ramirez, known as El Tigre, who was an important figure in Colombia's Norte del Valle cartel. Their relationship was both personal and professional. Through Espinoza, Sandra built a direct line between Mexican and Colombian trafficking networks that moved cocaine north toward the United States. She developed smuggling routes along Mexico's Pacific coast and became known well enough within the underworld that Los Tucanes de Tijuana, one of Mexico's most famous narco-corrido bands, wrote a folk ballad paying tribute to her as a top lady who is a key part of the business. In 2001, the Mexican Navy seized a ship in the Pacific port of Manzanillo carrying more than 9 tons of cocaine. The shipment was traced back to Sandra and Espinoza. That seizure should have ended her career immediately. Instead, it launched a 5-year investigation that required more than 30 federal agents to close. Sandra managed to stay ahead of it. She was living in Guadalajara and Hermosillo, moving between cities, maintaining a lifestyle that looked, on the surface, like that of a wealthy businesswoman. Neighbors and acquaintances described her as friendly and unsuspicious. A valet parker outside one of the beauty salons she used told the Associated Press he never thought she could be up to anything wrong. What broke through her cover was not the cocaine seizure directly. It was her son. In April 2002, An armed commando kidnapped her 15-year-old son, Jose Luis, outside a gym in Guadalajara. Sandra contacted the authorities for help, which was itself a risk. The ransom demand was reported by police at $5 million. The fact that she had that kind of money available, and that she ultimately negotiated the return of her son herself, paying what was reportedly $3 million,
made investigators look at her far more carefully than they had before. She later told the Daily Beast that the kidnapping was the greatest pain she had ever been through in her life. It took until September 2007 for Mexican authorities to finally arrest her. She was stopped at a restaurant in the San Jeronimo neighborhood of Mexico City. Her arrest became immediate national news. Video captured her being handcuffed while smiling calmly at the camera, chatting casually with the officers processing her, telling them she was just a housewife and businesswoman. That footage spread across television and the internet. It made her famous in a way that transcended the cartel world. She became a cultural figure. The narco corrido dedicated to her played constantly on Mexican radio in the days after her arrest. She spent the next several years fighting extradition to the United States. During her time in the Santa Marta Acatitla Women's Prison in Mexico City, she filed a human rights complaint about insects in her cell and restrictions on outside food. An investigation was launched in January 2011 after a doctor entered the prison to give her a Botox injection, a treatment not authorized for inmates. The prison director and hospital chief were removed from their positions over the incident. Sandra Avila Beltran, even behind bars, was not living like an ordinary prisoner. She was extradited to the United States in August 2012 and faced cocaine trafficking charges in Florida. In April 2013, she pleaded guilty to being an accessory after the fact for providing financial assistance to Espinoza to help him avoid authorities between 2002 and 2004. She was sentenced to 70 months in federal custody but received credit for time already served. She was deported back to Mexico in August 2013, immediately arrested again on money laundering charges, convicted, and then released in 2015 after the conviction was thrown out by Mexican courts. She had spent over 7 years behind bars in total across 2 countries. By 2015, she was free and living in Guadalajara. She had accumulated 15 homes, 30 cars, and a gold pendant modeled on Tutankhamun featuring 83 rubies, 228 diamonds, and 189 sapphires. Author Arturo Pérez Reverte stated publicly that the character of Teresa Mendoza in his novel The Queen of the South was partly based on her life. Netflix's Narcos Mexico later created a character named Isabela Bautista, described by multiple outlets as being loosely based on Sandra, who served as Felix Gallardo's key female ally and cross-border connection. The fictional version was arrested and faced consequences relatively quickly. The real Sandra spent years as one of the most powerful women in North American drug trafficking before anyone stopped her, and even then, the courts let her walk. Sandra used charm and relationships to build power across international borders. The next woman on this list built her power differently. Maria Guadalupe Lopez Esquivel was 21 years old, commanded a hit squad, and in a single night ordered an ambush that killed 13 police officers. Section 4. La Catrina, the 21-year-old who massacred 13 police officers. Maria Guadalupe Lopez Esquivel grew up in Buena Vista, Michoacán, and later moved to Tepalcatepec, a small municipality in what is known as the Tierra Caliente, the Hot Land, a region of western Mexico that has been one of the most contested and violent cartel territories in the country for decades. People who knew her in her early years described her as a good student. She attended primary school in Tepalcatepec and by most accounts had a relatively ordinary childhood. Her father was a livestock trader. Her mother was a housewife. There was nothing in her early life that would have marked her as someone who would go on to command a cartel hit squad before her 20th birthday.
The shift happened in 2017.
She was around 18 years old when she met Miguel Fernandez, a man known by his alias LM2, who operated as a plaza chief for the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, known as the CJNG, in the Tierra Caliente region. The CJNG was founded by Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, known as El Mencho, and by the mid-2000s had grown into what U.S. and Mexican authorities considered the most powerful and dangerous cartel in Mexico. It operated in approximately 75% of Mexican states and had trafficking networks extending into Europe, Asia, Australia, and across the Americas. El Mencho was at the time one of the most wanted criminals on Earth, with a multi-million-dollar reward offered by the U.S. government for information leading to his capture. Maria fell in love with LM2 and moved with him to Aguililla, a municipality in Michoacán, where the CJNG was fighting for control against rival criminal groups. A local resident told the Mexican newspaper El Universal that she started hanging out with gangsters and got lost in drugs. Another resident said she moved in with LM2 and started working for him shortly after arriving. She rose through the cartel structure quickly. Within 2 years of joining the organization, she was in charge of paying salaries to the network of halcones, the Spanish word for hawks, which is what cartels call their lookouts and informants who monitor police and military movements and report back to the organization. She was also coordinating assassinations, extortion operations, and kidnappings. She earned the nickname La Catrina, taken from La Calavera Catrina, the elegant female skeletal figure that is one of the most iconic symbols of Mexico's Day of the Dead celebration. On October 14, 2019, a convoy of Michoacán State Police was traveling through the municipality of Aguililla on a surveillance operation. What happened next was not a spontaneous confrontation. It was a planned ambush. A group of CJNG hitmen, operating under orders from LM2 and coordinated by Maria, attacked the convoy. 14 police officers were killed and 9 more were wounded. After the attack, the gunmen placed narcomantas, which are cloth banners used by cartels to send public messages, on the windshields of the police vehicles. The messages were signed CJNG and contained threats of further attacks. Mexican authorities later obtained audio recordings from the operation. In those recordings, LM2 could be heard giving the order. Maria could be heard confirming that the mission would be carried out exactly as instructed. She was 20 years old when she directed that ambush. Mexican authorities identified her as one of the key figures responsible for the attack and began working to locate her. Less than 3 months later, on a Friday in January 2020, security forces received a tip about her location. The Mexican Army, the National Guard, and Michoacán State Police moved to a small community called La Bocanada in the municipality of Tepocatepec. When they arrived and dismantled a blockade at the entrance to the town, the cartel members inside opened fire. A gun battle broke out. 6 male cartel members were captured during the confrontation. 1 woman was shot. State officials initially did not release the identity of the woman who had been wounded. Then video and photographs began circulating online. The footage showed a young woman on the ground, shot in the neck, her face and clothing covered in blood. A tattoo on her thigh was visible in the images. The tattoo matched photographs of Maria that had previously circulated on social media, where she had maintained a public presence, posting images of herself with luxury goods, expensive vehicles, gold-plated firearms, and armed bodyguards. The tattoo confirmed it. The wounded woman was Maria Guadalupe Lopez Esquivel. She was 21 years old. Body camera footage recorded during the operation captured the moments after she was shot. She was crouched behind a wall, struggling to breathe, reaching toward the camera. A police officer crouched beside her and spoke to her directly. The officer told her to calm down, that the helicopter was coming, that it was on its way, that she needed to try to hang on. The footage showed her in obvious distress. The composed and feared cartel commander reduced to a frightened young woman bleeding out in the dirt of the same region where she had grown up.
The helicopter came. She was airlifted toward a hospital. She died from blood loss during the flight, several minutes after takeoff, before reaching medical care. She was 21 years old. Documents recovered from cartel vehicles seized after the October ambush provided investigators with details about her specific role in the organization's financial and operational structure. Those documents confirmed she had been responsible for the Halcón payment network and that she had been given direct authority over the hit squad that carried out the police massacre. LM2, Miguel Fernandez, was arrested during the same January operation that killed Maria. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The CJNG is the cartel that produced La Catrina.
It is also the cartel that Rosalinda González Valencia helped build from the ground up, long before El Mencho became the most wanted man in Mexico. While Maria López Esquivel was the violent face of the organization in Michoacán, González Valencia was the financial architecture holding the entire structure together from Jalisco, running an empire of legitimate-looking businesses that kept billions of dollars moving cleanly through the global financial system. Section 5. Rosalinda González Valencia. La Jefa, the economic spine of the world's most dangerous cartel. Rosalinda González Valencia was born in 1963 in rural Michoacán, the same state where La Catrina would later command a hit squad decades later. She grew up as the eldest of her sisters in a family of 18 siblings. The family originally farmed avocados. That agricultural life did not last. By the 1970s, the González Valencia family had shifted from growing avocados to cultivating marijuana and opium poppy on clandestine plantations in the mountains of Michoacán, the same verdant hills that have supplied Mexico's drug trade with raw product for generations. Her family did not drift into organized crime gradually. They built it into the foundation of everything they did. The family's criminal history ran deep and wide. Rosalinda's uncle was Armando Valencia Cornelio, known by his alias El Maradona, who founded the Milenio Cartel, one of the predecessor organizations that would eventually fracture and reform into the Jalisco New Generation Cartel around 2010. Her brother Abigail González Valencia went on to found Los Queenies, a separate but deeply connected criminal organization that functioned as the primary money laundering arm for the CJNG. Los Queenies was not a minor operation. It built a financial empire that included shopping malls, hotels, real estate agencies, restaurants, and a tequila company, all used to funnel cartel profits into clean, usable money. The U.S. Treasury and Mexican authorities both identified Los Queenies as one of the most sophisticated money laundering networks connected to any Mexican cartel. Rosalinda married Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes in 1996. Oseguera, who would become known to the world as El Mencho, had grown up in the same rural community as her family. He had worked as a guard on the González Valencia family's marijuana plantations before eventually joining the family's trafficking operation. After he was deported from the United States back to Mexico, he joined a local police force, which was a common path for men who wanted to use law enforcement access and knowledge to benefit cartel operations. His marriage to Rosalinda in 1996 was not merely personal. It formalized his relationship with one of the most established criminal families in Michoacán and gave him access to the networks, money, and infrastructure the González Valencia clan had spent decades building. According to reporting at the time of El Mencho's death in February 2026, his initial influence in the CJNG came directly through that marriage. Together, they had 3 children: Jessica Johanna, Rubén, and Laisha Michelle. Rubén Oseguera González, known as El Menchito, was eventually arrested in Mexico and extradited to the United States, where he has been serving a prison sentence since 2020. The cartel business was a family enterprise in every sense. Mexico's Secretariat of the Interior formally alleged that Rosalinda oversaw the CJNG's financial and legal resources, including more than 70 businesses affiliated with the criminal group. These were not small corner operations. The businesses spanned multiple sectors and were spread across Mexico and beyond. Insight Crime, which extensively investigated the CJNG's financial structure, reported that the money laundering connections tied to the González Valencia family extended to Brazil and Uruguay, meaning the financial reach of the organization Rosalinda helped manage was genuinely international. She was first arrested on May 26, 2018, by the Mexican Navy in Zapopan, Jalisco. The charge was money laundering. 3 months later, after legal battles and hearings conducted behind closed doors, a judge granted her release on bail after she paid a fine of 1.5 million Mexican pesos, approximately $72,000 at the time. The money laundering charges from that first arrest were eventually set aside due to insufficient evidence. She walked out of custody and returned to Jalisco. She was rearrested on November 15, 2021, again in Zapopan. Mexican authorities described her second arrest as a significant blow to the financial structure of organized crime in the state of Jalisco. Her trial proceeded behind closed doors. In December 2023, a judge sentenced her to 5 years in prison. The specific conviction was for failing to disclose financial transactions between 2015 and 2016 related to a car wash she operated in Puerto Vallarta. Her lawyer argued the conviction did not connect her to organized crime directly and did not constitute money laundering in the formal legal sense. The lawyer planned to appeal. Rosalinda served her sentence at the Federal Center for Social Readaptation for Women in Cuautlan del Rio, in the state of Morelos. During her imprisonment, reports emerged about serious health problems. In August 2023, the Spanish newspaper La Vanguardia reported that she was dealing with hypertension and an undisclosed terminal illness, and that her overall condition was described as extremely delicate. Her defense team successfully petitioned for her to receive treatment for her various illnesses. On January 29, 2025, a federal judge approved an early release on the grounds that she had served more than half her sentence and had demonstrated good conduct throughout her time in custody. On February 27, 2025, Rosalinda González Valencia walked out of the Federal Center for Social Readaptation for Women and returned to the outside world. El Mencho was killed by Mexican forces with U.S. intelligence support in a military operation in Talpalpa in February 2026. Reports following his death confirmed what investigators had long argued, that the organizational power of the CJNG was never solely his. The financial governance, the kinship networks, the laundering infrastructure built through decades of González Valencia family activity, these were the systems that kept the cartel functioning through arrests, crackdowns, and leadership pressure. Following El Mencho's death, the Wall Street Journal and El País both reported that the new head of the CJNG was Juan Carlos Valencia González, Rosalinda's son from her first relationship before El Mencho. The cartel, built in part on her family's foundations, was now being passed to her son. Rosalinda González Valencia ran the economic side of the most dangerous cartel in Mexico. She did it through businesses, shell companies, family loyalty, and financial systems sophisticated enough to move money across multiple countries without triggering sustained legal scrutiny. The fact that the most powerful cartel in Mexico transferred leadership to her son after El Mencho's death says more about where the real power sat than any title ever could. What Rosalinda built was about money and architecture. The next section is about something different entirely. It is about why cartels deliberately use women at every level of their operations, why law enforcement consistently fails to see it coming, and how that blind spot has been exploited for decades. Section 6. How cartels use women specifically because law enforcement ignores them. The assumption that cartels are exclusively male organizations has never been accurate. But that assumption has been useful, and not just to television producers looking for a clean narrative. It has been useful to the cartels themselves.
For decades, the Mexican drug trade has deliberately positioned women in operational roles precisely because law enforcement, military forces, and border security agencies were trained to look for men. The blind spot was not accidental. It was exploited systematically, and the organizations that exploited it most effectively built some of the most durable drug trafficking infrastructure in the world. The mechanics of this are straightforward.
When police and soldiers conduct operations against cartels, their threat assessments are built around profiles. Those profiles have historically centered on men. A woman carrying a package through a crowd, driving a car across a border checkpoint, walking into a bank with a deposit, or managing a business in a strip mall does not fit the profile that triggers heightened scrutiny. Cartels understood this before researchers documented it. Gender stereotypes that make women appear less suspicious of wrongdoing help them move through public spaces and border crossings with less attention from the police and military personnel running Mexico's organized crime crackdowns. That is not a theory. It is a documented operational advantage that these organizations have used consistently. Nathan Jones, a professor at Sam Houston State University and the author of the book Mexico's Illicit Drug Networks and the State Reaction, has studied the rise of women in cartel operations for years. He identified a specific law enforcement dynamic that accelerated female participation at the leadership level. The strategy employed by Mexican and American authorities against cartels for years has been called the kingpin strategy. The logic is simple. Identify the most important person in the organization, target them, remove them, and watch the structure collapse. The problem with that logic is that it assumed the most important person was always the most visible one, and that removing that person would leave a void that could not be filled. Jones explained that when law enforcement targets the husband in a cartel operation, the wife frequently knows everything about how those operations run. She has often been involved. She understands the networks. She knows the suppliers and the distributors and the corrupt officials on the payroll. When the husband is arrested, the wife continues running the operation. The kingpin strategy, designed to decapitate criminal organizations, repeatedly created conditions where women stepped into leadership roles that law enforcement was completely unprepared to address. This pattern appeared across multiple major cases. When Eduardo Arellano Felix was arrested in 2008, his sister Enedina, who had been managing the Tijuana cartel's finances for years, moved into the top leadership role. When El Mencho became the primary target of law enforcement attention in Mexico and the United States, his wife, Rosalinda González Valencia, had already built the financial infrastructure that kept the CJNG funded and operational. These were not cases of women suddenly stepping up in emergencies. They were cases of women who had been central to the organization all along, finally becoming visible because the men around them were gone. The operational roles women fill inside cartels span the entire structure of the organization. At the lower levels, women work as mules, carrying drugs across borders in their bodies, in luggage, in vehicles, in the clothing they wear. They work as halconas, the female version of the Hawk lookout system, monitoring police and military movements and reporting back to the organization by phone. They manage safe houses, distribute payments to cartel workers, and run the street-level sales operations that generate daily revenue. Research published through the University of Mississippi examining women in the Sinaloa cartel specifically found that women occupied strategic and tactical roles across the organization that had previously been allocated to men alone. The same research identified this as a new and growing threat to law enforcement in both Mexico and the United States because of the persistent perception that women in these environments are victims rather than operators. At the higher levels, women manage finances, oversee logistics, maintain relationships with corrupt officials, and run the money laundering operations that turn billions of dollars in drug revenue into clean assets. These are not supporting roles. They are the roles that determine whether an organization survives or collapses when pressure is applied. Academic research on organized crime has increasingly documented that the durability of a criminal organization depends more on its financial governance and logistical systems than on its capacity for violence. The people running those systems inside Mexican cartels have frequently been women. Vice News investigated this phenomenon and produced reporting describing these women as las patronas, the female bosses, documenting their existence across multiple organizations and in multiple countries. Historian Elaine Carey, who wrote the book Women Drug Traffickers, traced female participation in the drug trade between the United States and Mexico back to the 1920s and 1930s, establishing that this was not a new development, but a consistent feature of the trade that had been systematically overlooked by researchers and law enforcement alike. The numbers, while difficult to verify precisely given the nature of the organizations involved, point to a clear trend. Research on Mexican criminal organizations suggested they recruit roughly 7,000 members per year, with women making up between 5 and 8% of new recruits annually, meaning somewhere between 350 and 560 women enter these organizations every year. Those figures cover only formal recruitment into identified organizations. They do not capture the full range of women operating within cartel ecosystems in roles that are not formally tracked. Women are also being incarcerated for drug offenses at a greater rate than men across Latin American countries, which reflects both their increasing operational involvement and the way criminal justice systems in the region process drug cases. Women arrested on drug charges are frequently lower-level participants who receive sentences disproportionate to their actual role in the organization, while the women operating at the financial and logistical levels often remain untouched for years. The blind spot that allowed all of this to develop over decades did not form in isolation. It was reinforced by exactly the kind of cultural narrative that shows like Narcos built and popularized. A world where cartel power was male, violence was male, and women existed at the edges. That narrative shaped public perception, and, critically, it shaped institutional assumptions about who was worth watching and who was not. __quote __to ___. The systems and the spractical systems are made up of individual people making individual choices. The next section is about the women who chose this life not because they were coerced or left with no alternative, but because they wanted the power, the money, and the status it provided, and what that means for the organizations they joined. Section 7. The growing numbers. More women are joining than ever before. For most of the history of the Mexican drug trade, women who appeared in law enforcement records were there in one of two ways. They were victims, women who had been trafficked, assaulted, or killed in the conflict. Or they were peripheral figures, wives and girlfriends who happened to be present when their male partners were arrested. The idea that women were joining these organizations voluntarily, in growing numbers, across multiple cartels, in roles that went far beyond carrying packages across a border, was not something that made it into official threat assessments or public reporting for a long time. That has changed. The documented evidence now shows a clear and sustained increase in female participation across Mexican criminal organizations, and the reasons behind that increase are more complicated than most people expect. Research commissioned by the Mexican government and analyzed by Angelica Ospina Escobar found that women were joining the Sinaloa Cartel, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, and the Cartel del Sur in greater numbers than at any documented point in the history of these organizations. The roles they were filling ranged from car theft to managing drug sales points to working as supervisors, assassins, and operational coordinators. These were not fringe positions. They were core functions inside organizations that collectively generated tens of billions of dollars annually from drug trafficking alone.
The recruitment numbers, while inherently difficult to verify given that these organizations do not publish membership data, point in a consistent direction. Estimates based on available intelligence suggested that Mexican criminal organizations recruit approximately 7,000 new members per year. Women were estimated to make up between 5 and 8% of those recruits, which translates to between 350 and 560 women entering these organizations annually through formal recruitment channels. That figure does not include women who enter cartel ecosystems through relationships, family connections,
or informal arrangements that do not get captured in standard recruitment tracking. The University of Mississippi research examining women in the Sinaloa cartel specifically identified two primary reasons women entered these organizations. The first was coercion, being brought in by male partners, family members, or through threats and force. The second was voluntary participation, driven by economic motivation and the desire for upward mobility. The research found that single motherhood had a particularly significant impact on voluntary participation decisions. Women raising children alone in regions where the formal economy offered poverty wages, limited opportunity, and no realistic path to financial security faced a calculation that the cartel economy made brutally simple. The money was real, it was immediate, and it was more than anything the legitimate job market in those areas was offering. But economic desperation alone does not explain the full picture, and flattening every woman's entry into cartel life into a story of poverty and necessity misrepresents what the data actually shows. The research documented women who entered cartel life for the same reasons men do: for power, for status, for the adrenaline, for the identity it provided. Sandra Avila Beltran told the Daily Beast that adrenaline is a drug and an addiction, describing the years she spent as a fugitive as tiring, but also thrilling. La Catrina maintained a social media presence filled with luxury goods, firearms, and bodyguards that was not the behavior of someone ashamed of her position. These were women who had embraced what they were doing and the identity that came with it. The impact of female participation on the next generation is one of the most sobering documented consequences of this trend. Vice News reported on interviews with incarcerated women whose children had begun engaging in cartel activity while their mothers were in prison. One woman described her youngest son visiting her in prison when he was 10 years old. By the time of one of his later visits, he had money, and when she asked him where it came from, he told her he had done what he had to do to buy her a proper meal inside. The cycle of cartel involvement, passing from parent to child through incarceration rather than presence, is one of the documented long-term effects of women entering these organizations. And it is a dynamic that expands the cartel's reach into the next generation in ways that are very difficult for law enforcement to interrupt. Women are being incarcerated for drug offenses at a higher rate than men across Latin American countries. That statistic sounds like evidence of enforcement success, but researchers and criminal justice analysts have consistently pointed out that it reflects something more troubling. The women being arrested and convicted at high rates are frequently the most replaceable members of the organizations they work for: street-level mules, lower-tier distributors, and small-scale operators whose loss does not meaningfully damage the cartel's capacity. The women operating at the financial and logistical levels, the Enadinas and the Rosalindas, are rarely the ones being processed through the criminal justice system. The enforcement pattern catches the bottom and misses the top. Historian Elaine Carey, whose book Women Drug Traffickers documented female participation in the cross-border drug trade going back to the 1920s, established that this is not a modern phenomenon that emerged recently. Women have been part of this trade for as long as the trade has existed. What has changed is the scale, the visibility, and the organizational depth of their involvement. The cartels that operate today are vastly larger, more sophisticated, and more deeply embedded in the global economy than the organizations of the 1920s. Women who participate in those organizations today are operating inside structures that are genuinely global in reach. Vice News used the term las patronas, the female bosses, in their investigation into women leading criminal organizations across Mexico and Latin America. The term captured something real. These were not women hovering at the edges of male-dominated power structures. They were running sections of those structures independently, making decisions, directing operations, and, in some cases, building organizations that outlasted the men who had originally led them. The numbers explain the scale. The structural dynamics explain the system. But neither fully explains what it looks like when a woman inside one of these organizations makes the choice to pick up a weapon and become an enforcer. The next section covers the female hitmen, the sicarias, who operated inside these cartels, and what their documented cases reveal about how far female participation in cartel violence actually goes. Section 8. The sicaria, female hitmen who are documented and feared. The word sicario comes from Latin, originally referring to assassins who used small daggers called sicai. In modern Mexican cartel terminology, a sicario is a hitman, a person whose job inside the organization is to kill. It is one of the most visible and most dangerous roles in any cartel, and it has historically been associated almost entirely with men. The reality documented by journalists, law enforcement agencies, and researchers is that women have been working as sicarias inside Mexican cartels for years, and some of them built reputations for violence that their male colleagues found difficult to match. Understanding why cartels use women as enforcers requires understanding what a sicaria offers that a male hitman sometimes does not. The same operational logic that makes women valuable as mules and lookouts applies in enforcement contexts. A woman approaching a target, entering a location, or moving through a neighborhood draws less immediate suspicion than a man in the same circumstances. In environments where cartel members and their targets are both watching for threats, a woman can get closer before anyone reacts. That tactical advantage is real and documented, and cartels have used it deliberately. La Catrina, whose full story was covered in Section 4, is the most extensively documented female sicaria in recent Mexican cartel history. She commanded a hit squad for the CJNG at 20 years old and directed the ambush that killed 13 state police officers in October 2019. Her case established something important beyond the details of her individual crimes. It established that a woman could rise to a genuine leadership position within a cartel's enforcement structure, not just participate in violence as a foot soldier, but plan it, coordinate it, and direct it against law enforcement targets. The audio recordings obtained by authorities after the October ambush, in which her superior gives the order and she confirms execution, document this in her own words. Juana, known by her alias La Peque, followed a path into cartel violence that was shaped heavily by economic desperation. She was born in the state of Hidalgo and became a mother at 15 years old. Raising a child alone with no financial resources, she eventually turned to sex work to survive. Those connections led her into contact with the Los Zetas cartel, one of the most brutal criminal organizations in Mexican history, originally founded by former members of an elite Mexican military unit who brought military-grade training and tactics into the drug trade. Los Zetas were known for extreme violence, even by cartel standards, including documented use of beheadings, dismemberment, and mass killings as tools of territorial control and intimidation. La Peque was recruited into Los Zetas initially as an informant. She did not stay at that level. She moved into active enforcement and was alleged to have participated in beheadings and mutilations while working for the cartel. Melissa Margarita Calderon Ojeda, known as La China, joined the Sinaloa cartel in 2005, specifically the Damaso cartel subdivision operating within the broader Sinaloa structure. She was born on August 12, 1984. By the time she was 20 years old, she had already decided on her path.
By 2008, 3 years after joining the organization,
She had been given command of an armed unit. Law enforcement and her own male colleagues documented that the rate of criminal activity in her area of operations increased significantly during her command. She was described as ruthless and ambitious, someone who used both aggression and, when it served her purposes, personal charm to advance within the organization. The fact that the people around her were almost all men did not slow her down. The Mirror US, reporting on female cartel enforcers, documented the broader pattern these individual cases represent. Los Zetas were not the only organization with female killers operating in enforcement roles. The CJNG, the Sinaloa Cartel, and connected organizations all had documented cases of women working as sicarias. What distinguished the most prominent cases was not just the violence itself, but the organizational authority these women held. La Catrina was not just participating in cartel violence, she was directing it and managing the logistical support structure, including the Halcon payment network that made sustained operations possible. The social media dimension of female sicaria culture is a documented phenomenon that intersects with the enforcement role in specific ways. La Catrina maintained an active social media presence before her death, posting photographs of herself with luxury vehicles, gold-plated firearms, designer clothing, and bodyguards. This was not unusual among female cartel members who had reached visible positions within their organizations. The Mirror, US, noted that Claudia Ochoa Felix, who became known in media as the Kim Kardashian of organized crime due to her social media presence, was associated with Los Antrax, the enforcement and assassination branch of the Sinaloa Cartel. She posted images of herself with pink AK-47s, luxury vehicles, and large amounts of cash. She denied involvement in illegal activities. Her alleged husband, Jose Gamboa, commanded Los Antrax before his arrest. Following his capture, she was reported to have taken control of the unit. The Texas Standard, reporting on women rising within Mexican drug cartels, noted that the media coverage of female cartel members with social media presences sometimes sensationalized the phenomenon in ways that obscured the underlying reality. The photographs were real. The weapons were real. The organizational positions some of these women held were real. But the coverage often treated it as spectacle rather than as evidence of a structural shift in how these organizations operate and who they trust with their most sensitive and dangerous work. Wikipedia's documented entry on women in the Mexican drug war confirms that female assassins have been active participants in the conflict since it escalated in 2006, working for all major belligerents. The entry also confirms that women have been killed in enforcement operations, caught in crossfire, and targeted for assassination themselves, which reflects the reality that participation in cartel violence at any level carries the same terminal risks regardless of gender. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The sicarias represent the most visible and dramatic form of female cartel participation. But the section that follows addresses something that operates at a deeper level than individual violence: the structural reality of how family relationships, kinship ties, and the concept of loyalty within these organizations have made women not just participants, but essential pillars of how cartels sustain themselves across generations. Section 9. Kinship Capitalism. Why family is the real power structure Narcos misses. There is a concept that researchers who study organized crime have increasingly used to describe how cartels actually function at their core. The term is kinship capitalism. It refers to the way criminal organizations use family relationships, blood ties, and marriage alliances, not sentimentally, but strategically, as the primary mechanism through which trust is established, power is transferred, loyalty is enforced, and operations survive external pressure. It is not a romantic idea. It is a business model, and it is the single most important structural feature of Mexican cartel operations
that shows like Narcos consistently failed to portray accurately. Because understanding it requires understanding that the women inside these families were not decorative. They were load-bearing. The logic of kinship capitalism starts with a problem that every criminal organization faces, and that legitimate businesses do not. In a legal business, contracts are enforceable. If someone steals from you or betrays you, there are courts, lawyers, and police. In a criminal organization, none of those mechanisms are available. Betrayal cannot be punished through legal channels.
Information shared with the wrong person can result in arrest, imprisonment, or death. The solution that cartels arrived at, and that has defined the structure of Mexican drug trafficking organizations for decades, is to conduct the most sensitive and critical business through people whose loyalty is secured not by contract, but by blood. Family members, specifically wives, sisters, daughters, and mothers, became the trusted operators of the systems that could not be handed to employees whose loyalty might be bought by a rival or a law enforcement agency offering a reduced sentence. The Arellano Felix family demonstrated this with complete clarity. The Tijuana cartel was built by brothers, but it was sustained across decades of arrests and killings by a sister. Enedina Arellano Felix managed the financial operations that kept the organization funded through the loss of one brother after another. She was not brought in as an emergency replacement when the men fell. She had been central to the operation for years before any of her brothers were removed. The cartel survived as long as it did, not because of the brothers who ran the violence, but because of the sister who ran the money. When the last brother standing was arrested in 2008, the organization did not collapse. It adapted because the financial infrastructure Enedina had built was still intact and she was still running it. The González Valencia family and the CJNG provide an even more recent and fully documented example. Rosalinda González Valencia did not marry El Mencho and then begin working for the cartel he built. The sequence ran in the opposite direction. El Mencho worked for her family before she married him. He guarded her family's marijuana plantations. He joined her family's trafficking network. His marriage to her in 1996 gave him access to the Valencia clan's resources, connections, and criminal infrastructure, all of which became the foundation on which the CJNG was built. The most dangerous cartel in Mexico at the time of El Mencho's death in February 2026 existed because a woman's family built the architecture that made it possible. When El Mencho was killed, the leadership of the CJNG passed to Juan Carlos Valencia González, Rosalinda's son from her first relationship. The cartel, founded on her family's foundations, passed to her son. The kinship structure held even through the death of the man the world identified as its leader. The Conversation, an academic publication that publishes peer-reviewed analysis, addressed this dynamic directly in a piece written after El Mencho's death. The analysis made the point that decapitation strategies, which are the law enforcement and military approaches built around removing the top leader of a criminal organization, rest on an assumption that has repeatedly proven false. The assumption is that criminal organizations are vertically dependent on a single male figure at the top, and that removing him will cause the structure below to collapse or descend into chaos. What the evidence shows instead is that when financial governance and kinship networks remain intact, the system regenerates. The women managing those systems are the reason the system regenerates. This reality creates a specific and documented problem for law enforcement. When investigators build a case against a cartel, they build it around the people they can see making decisions, giving orders, and directing violence. Those people are usually men. The women managing finances, maintaining relationships with corrupt officials, overseeing logistics, and holding the organizational knowledge that allows the cartel to function are operating in roles that are less visible and that generate less of the kind of evidence, intercepted communications about planned violence, surveillance footage of weapons transfers, informant testimony about shootings, that law enforcement cases are built around.
The result is that the most structurally important members of the organization are frequently the last ones targeted and the hardest ones to prosecute successfully.
Inside Crime's analysis of the CJNG's financial structure documented this pattern specifically in relation to Los Queenies, the money laundering organization founded by Rosalinda's brother, Abigail Gonzalez Valencia. Los Queenies built an asset portfolio that included shopping malls, hotels, real estate, restaurants, and a tequila company. The arrests of multiple Gonzalez Valencia family members revealed money laundering connections extending to Brazil and Uruguay. Those connections did not exist because of El Mencho. They existed because of a family that had been in the criminal business since the 1970s and had spent decades building international financial relationships. El Mencho was the face. The Valencia family was the foundation. The kinship structure also explains why cartel power does not simply disappear when the most visible figures are removed. It disperses through family networks that were never fully visible to investigators in the first place, reconstitutes around surviving family members, and continues operating using systems and relationships that predate the specific leader law enforcement was focused on removing. Narcos built its entire narrative around charismatic male kingpins because that is where the drama visually lives. The shootouts, the escapes, the interrogations, the territorial wars. Those are the things that make compelling television. What the show never found a way to dramatize was the accountant sister who outlasted every man in her family, the wife whose family name made the empire possible, the financial systems that kept running quietly in the background while the men were being arrested and killed and celebrated in equal measure. The final section brings all of this together. Section 10 closes the gap between the show and the reality by looking at the specific women Narcos Mexico tried to portray, what the show got right, what it deliberately simplified, and what the full documented truth of those women's lives reveals about the distance between the cartel world as entertainment and the cartel world as it actually existed. Section 10. The Narcos, Mexico. Women who were real and far more dangerous than shown. Narcos Mexico made a genuine attempt to do something the original Narcos series largely refused to do. It put women in the story as operational figures rather than purely decorative ones. Enedina Arellano Felix appeared as a character who was openly identified as the financial brain of the Tijuana cartel. A fictional character named Isabela Bautista served as Felix Gallardo's key female ally and cross-border connection to Colombian suppliers. These were steps forward from a show that had spent seasons reducing women to crying wives and background decoration. The problem was that the real women behind those characters were significantly more dangerous, more durable, and more consequential than anything the show put on screen. The gap between the Narcos Mexico version and the documented reality is the gap between a story designed to be watched comfortably and a history that is genuinely unsettling. Start with Enedina. Narcos Mexico portrayed her as the brains behind her brother's operation, a woman who pushed for strategic moves her brothers were reluctant to make, including the decision to break away from the Guadalajara cartel and source cocaine directly from the Cali cartel in Colombia after the Silmar warehouse bust. Multiple outlets covering the show's accuracy, including Collider, noted that none of this seemed very far from the truth. The real Enedina was indeed the financial architect of the organization, and she did push for strategic expansions that her brothers resisted. The show got the broad shape of her role correct. What the show could not fully convey was the permanence of what she built. Narcos Mexico ended its run before the story reached the point where Enedina became the sole leader of the Tijuana cartel, following Eduardo's arrest in 2008. It did not show her leading the organization through the years that followed, navigating a truce with the Sinaloa cartel that stabilized Tijuana after years of devastating open warfare. rebuilding the financial pipelines after law enforcement pressure had disrupted them, and outlasting every single male figure who had stood above or beside her in the organization. The U.S. Treasury sanctioned her under the Foreign Narcotics Kingpin Designation Act in June 2000. That sanction remains on record. She has never been arrested. She has never faced charges. She is, as of the available documented record, still free. The show gave her a compelling role in the story of her brother's cartel. The reality is that she survived her brother's cartel entirely and kept it running after they were gone. The Isabella Bautista character is where the gap between fiction and reality becomes most instructive. Isabella Bautista never existed. She was a composite creation by the show's writers, and according to multiple analyses of the show's real-life counterparts, she was most heavily based on Sandra Avila Beltran. The connection makes sense structurally. Isabella served as the key cross-border link between the Guadalajara cartel and Colombian suppliers, using charm, relationships, and personal connections to bridge two powerful organizations. That is precisely what Sandra did in real life, serving as the connection between the Sinaloa cartel and the Norte del Valle cartel in Colombia, a role that U.S. and Mexican officials described as unprecedented for a woman in a major Mexican trafficking organization. The differences between Isabella Bautista and Sandra Avila Beltran are where the show's choices become visible. Isabella moved through the story as a figure whose fate was controlled by the men around her, rising and falling in relation to Felix Gallardo's decisions and fortunes. Sandra's real story was considerably more autonomous. She built her position through her own relationships, her own networks, and her own operational decisions. She moved 9 tons of cocaine. She spent 5 years as a fugitive after Mexican authorities began seriously investigating her, describing those years herself as tiring but also thrilling, driven by an adrenaline she compared to an addiction. When she was finally arrested in 2007, she was calm enough to smile at the cameras and chat casually with the officers processing her, while telling them she was just a housewife. That performance, entirely self-possessed and completely unbothered, was not scripted by anyone. It was who she was. The show also never engaged with what happened after Sandra's arrest, because her post-arrest story does not fit the clean narrative arc that television requires. She fought extradition for 5 years. She received Botox injections in prison, triggering an investigation that resulted in the prison director and hospital chief losing their jobs. She was extradited to the United States in 2012, pleaded guilty to a reduced charge in 2013, was sentenced to 70 months with credit for time served, deported back to Mexico, arrested again on money laundering charges, convicted, and then released in 2015 when the Mexican courts threw out that conviction. She walked out of custody after more than 7 years across 2 countries and went to live in Guadalajara. The system that was supposed to contain her processed her, held her, and eventually released her. She was in her mid-50s and free. Inside Crime, whose analysis of organized crime in Latin America is considered among the most reliable available, wrote explicitly that narco television shows consistently make the same error with female characters. Despite women being key players in illicit activities at every level, they are portrayed as secondary characters. The error is not random. It reflects a cultural assumption about where power lives and what it looks like. An assumption that the cartels themselves have exploited for decades by placing women in roles that law enforcement and media both consistently underestimated. Deborah Bonello, the journalist who spent years researching women in Latin American cartels and published her findings in the book Narcos, The Secret Rise of Women in Latin America's Cartels, described the female cartel killers, money launderers, logistical heads, and transporters she documented as women who were often as ambitious, innovative, ruthless, and violent as their male counterparts. The Economist called the book a valuable introduction to a subject that deserves more research. Kirkus Reviews wrote,
that it busts the myth that these women are mere victims.
Publishers Weekly recommended it to readers interested in organized crime and investigative journalism. The women covered across these 10 sections: Enedina Arellano Felix, Sandra Avila Beltran, Maria Guadalupe López Esquivel, and Rosalinda González Valencia, are not outliers or exceptions to a rule. They are documented examples of a pattern that researchers, law enforcement agencies, and investigative journalists have confirmed exists across multiple organizations, multiple countries, and multiple decades. The pattern is this: women have been essential to how these cartels function, how they survive, how they move money, how they enforce their authority, and how they transfer power from one generation to the next. Narcos built a world where that was invisible. The real history makes it impossible to ignore. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.